We invite Dr. Frank Boateng, who is a fellow IMANI. He is also Vice Dean, Office of Research, Innovation and Consultancy, and Senior Lecturer, Management Practice in Accounting at the University of Mines and Technology, to give us the opening remarks. Let's put our hands together and welcome him, please.
The age of technology, sometimes it tells you it's the strongest thing that is controlling the world. Good morning to you all, to the president of IMANI, to EPA, to all government agencies and development partners gathered here this morning. I think it's crucial that we continue our discussion, as my brother, the MC, indicated. Ghana is racing against time on its commitment to the intended nationally determined contributions to address this climate crisis. Ghana is expected to raise $6.3 billion US. This is about 82 billion Ghana cedi by 2030 from the domestic financial markets, corporations to complement international climate financing sources to implement the updated 34 mitigation and adoption mechanisms submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on the climate change, and then also to demonstrate its commitment to the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. Now, government intends to raise $3.7 billion US, 1.7 billion from the commercial market and the corporate social responsibility, respectively, and then also to commit 1.4 billion of the nation's budget to the domestic financing needs. Now, we all know, and judging from the current fiscal crisis in the country and the lack of readiness of the domestic private financial market and corporations to raise the needed finance, as well as the nation's ability to tap into external climate finance, leaves us to ask more questions than answers. Just a brief on our oil and gas investments of 14.2 billion. The actual climate financing inflow to Ghana from 2011 to 2019 was 1.3 billion. Grants and loans constituted about 91.1% of the total climate finance inflows for the period. Now, the contribution of the private sector and private foundations was 1.43%. This indicates a low domestic contribution to the climate financing inflows. Factors like the escalating public debt, low government revenue mobilization, and changing priorities of donors due to the pandemic and global crisis have rendered the national budget support, grants, and loans least reliable alternatives in the long run. In 2019, the government established the SDG Delivery and Green Funds to raise capital to support the implementation of the INDCs. The government expects that private sector will contribute about $100 million US in SDG Delivery Fund and $200 million US in the Green Funds to complement the stateside effort to address the financing gap. Also, the green bonds and carbon pricing are options government intends to integrate the private sector in the implementation of the climate mitigation. With the introduction of 3 new taxes that were recently passed and subsequently assented by the President of the Republic of Ghana, the question is, will private sector be able to commit as expected? To this, IMANI Ghana seeks to undertake an assessment of Ghana's readiness to finance the INDCs under the current fiscal crisis. We have a firm belief that Effective implementation of the INDCs could have a catalytic effect on job creation, community resilience, which will in effect help minimize poverty. The climate crisis poses a more severe socioeconomic threat if Ghana continues its current emission of 42.2 mtCO2e in 2016, using a business as usual scenario. Ghana's emission is likely to increase to about 73.95 mtCO2e by 2030. The high temperatures associated with the climate crisis will have a negative impact on agricultural productivity and threatens food security, since only 2% of arable lands has been irrigated. Additionally, the climate crisis will cause significant shock to Ghana's energy supply, since about 30% of electricity is sourced from hydropower. Implementing the mitigation and adaptation measures remains Ghana's surest bet to address the threats of the climate crisis. However, the institutional coordination and oversight, as well as the financial flow required to accelerate technology and capacity building, remains very, very weak. Also, accountability by CSOs and other demand-side actors have been low. We intend to align the INDCs to the industrial policies of Ghana to establish the socio-economic benefits and critically gauge the readiness of domestic and external finance market to support the implementation of Ghana's climate mitigation adoption strategies. Now, the real challenge. From 2022 to 2030, Ghana must raise 22.6 billion in investment to finance the updated 34 mitigation and adoption measures to address the effects of climate change and contribute to low carbon emission. However, there is little or no evidence about Ghana's readiness to finance the domestic and external, the INDCs. More seriously is the current fiscal crisis the country is facing. Between 2011 and 2019, actual climate change investment, excluding oil and gas investment, was about $1.3 billion US dollars. Almost 92% of the 1.3 billion were sourced from grants and loans, as indicated earlier, and less than 3% from the private sector foundation and technical corporations. This significant climate finance deficit in Ghana, and apart from the threats of the climate crisis, i.e. drought, food insecurity, and energy insecurity, Ghana can potentially miss the SDG 7, which is affordable and clean energy, as well as SDG 12, climate action. If the country fails to raise the requisite investment from now to 2030, there are dire consequences. In conclusion, we at IMANI are optimistic that our meeting today will spark the talking points that will help us do the following: analyze Ghana's readiness to attract climate financing under the current fiscal crisis. Analyze Ghana's readiness to attract climate financing from domestic and external private financial markets. Increase government's awareness and focus on the feasibility of the financing targets of the INDCs and available financing options. And then finally, increase the awareness and focus of civil society organizations to government's commitment to the INDCs to enhance accountability. I welcome all of you here this morning. Let's all participate and participate well and make sure that we gauge and help government achieve these targets. Thank you for your attention.
Let's put our hands together once again for Dr. Frank Boateng is a fellow, IMANI, Vice Dean Office of Research, Innovation and Consultancy, and Senior Lecturer of Management Practice in Accounting, University of Mines and Technology. So we have, he set the tone for a very busy morning that we have assigned ourselves to. We are going to find out if we are indeed ready as a country to finance climate, looking at how vulnerable we are or our economy is to climate change. We're going to invite another distinguished fellow to give us a presentation. But again, we want to continue to remind ourselves that we have a task ahead of us. Today, we seem to have a full house. We're also going to engage everybody in this auditorium. The last time we nearly closed, in the evening. We had a very tall order. Colleague journalists who are here who have covered climate change a lot. We have civil society organizations, government representatives. We're going to have a very insightful discussions, and we expect everyone to participate. On this note, I will invite Dr. Theophilus Echampong, who is economist, political risk analyst, and senior fellow, IMANI. Let's put our hands together for his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, I can't hear you too. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I think we can do well to just shake somebody next to you. You know, when you go to the churches, they'll say, shake somebody next to you and say hello to someone. All right. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's an exciting time to be in this climate business. And climate is development, but climate is also business. So really my job here this morning is very simple. It's just to tell a little story or narrative as to where we are in terms of the attracting climate-related financing as a country. But it's important to situate this in the broader context of what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. The last week I was involved in other conversations and deliberations where, again, from the side of government, you see a renewed push, an attempt to actually get the financing that is required. And I see a few of my friends that I interacted with. I see Mo, right? Yes, on here. So it's great to be here, and then it's great to talk through these set of issues here. So please forgive me. I will be bombarding you with a lot of statistics and numbers, but again, it helps us to situate things in the right context. So it's just, like I said, to talk a little bit about what's happening in an African context, and then whittle it down to the Ghanaian context, and open then the floor up for broader reflections on what do we do going forward. As the earlier speakers and Prof have already mentioned, we're in an economic crisis, and the financing flows that are required by the government for its main budget are not coming as we would expect. We're still negotiating with the IMF for 3 billion or so to support our economy. And then globally as well, there are a lot of headwinds in terms of the inflation that we're seeing. We're seeing central banks hike up policy rates. We're seeing multilateral institutions not committing as much resources as one would expect to support the climate, agenda. And even on you may argue, even on the energy policy front, some countries have started even going back to using some of the conventional energy resources, namely oil and gas and coal, in an attempt to safeguard the energy security of their nation. So I think this is quite important that we situate all of this within that context. But the starting point always has got to be, where does Africa sit in all of this broad conversation around climate? So I did look at the data, and in fact, you can actually extend this all the way back to the 1700s and add up cumulatively all countries globally up to 2021 in terms of the carbon dioxide emissions. So there are other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, but CO2 is the one that is gaining a lot of prominence in recent times. But what is quite striking really is that if you look at Africa, which is this color here, or turquoise, it's really insignificant in the grand scheme of things in terms of total cumulative emissions to date. You can see since the 1960s, of course, the rise of China, you can see the US, and then the other big industrial nations. But all of Africa combined to date has only been responsible for just about 4% of global CO2 emissions. The problem is that we also stand to bear the biggest consequences, negative consequences of the related effect in terms of the warming, climate in that regard. If you even take the emissions again and you divide it by your population size, which is this chart that you have on your right-hand side, you can see that per population, again, the more polluting or heavily polluting countries tend to be largely in the global north. So one of the arguments that has then been raised is if countries in sub-Saharan Africa, such as Ghana, have historically not contributed as much to this global phenomenon, but at the same time are bearing the negative consequences of that, then somebody has to provide some financing to support or to, reduce the effects of that climate related activity. So this is quite important. Just keep the 4% figure for Africa at the back of your mind. Then if you look at Ghana specifically, if we go back with the time series data going back to the early 90s and you add up all of our different greenhouse gas emissions, you can see that, by far, the CO2 is the most dominant emission source. And this is to be expected as your economy grows, as you start using more energy, and the energy intensity starts to increase. If you break it down even further, again in the Ghana case, you get a very interesting picture begin to emerge. That in most recent times, if we were to extend this to 2020, 2021, you will get a lot of emissions coming from the energy sector as the major contributing source or sector for net CO2 emissions. So the question then means fundamentally is that if Ghana wants to do its bit to help the global climate agenda, even though it's relatively small on the grand scale of things, then we need to look at a number of these sectors, particularly starting from the energy sector. And I'll show you in a moment, if you look at what the government has communicated and what it intends to do in terms of addressing the climate issues, there's a lot of emphasis on addressing or fixing the issues within the energy space, including, getting renewable energy and other related energy sources into the mix. Recently, the government published a framework, they call it the Energy Transition Framework, And if you look at the projections going into 2070, by the mid-2040s, our use of gas for thermal power would be going down, and we're going to get more renewable energy and also a lot more nuclear energy coming into the mix. The big question is, who's going to pay for all of this? And that really, I think, is quite important, and we'll come to that briefly in a moment. But the other point really is that, like I said, many of our African countries, including Ghana, are the ones that are going to be heavily impacted by climate change, and actually impacted for the worse, and not necessarily for the better. So there's one metric that actually a university in France, Notre Dame, actually does produce quite regularly. And here what they do is they measure a country's vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And in terms of that vulnerability, you also measure it on sort of two dimensions, right? So how vulnerable you are, and then how ready you are to, adapt to those effects. And Ghana sits in the top left-hand quadrant. So we're highly vulnerable, but we don't have, or are not ready as yet to address the effect. And you can actually see again in this big picture here with the color scheme here. So red going into yellow, worse, green is better. You can infer from that. And you can see Ghana sits here in the orange or just about yellow band. But the problem is that a lot of our African countries are going to be vulnerable. And what perhaps gets me also a little bit worried is that if you track that vulnerability over time, you can actually see it getting worse, right? And so we need to do something about it. And this is where the issue of the financing comes in, and it becomes extremely quite critical. So it's within this context and background that we've been doing this work. We've met some of you during the last stakeholder consultation session. We've met others privately to get your thoughts, your views, your ideas. But basically, there are three things that we're seeking to do with this particular project or exercise. The first one really is to, like Prof said, we want to analyze, are we actually, as a country, given all that I've said earlier and given all the vulnerability that we face, ready to get or attract the needed financing? That's the first thing. And this financing will come from both local and external sources. Number two is really within the broader stakeholder community, government, civil society, academia, the business side, private sector, you name it. I mean, what is the extent of our awareness and our sort of focus or drive in terms of ensuring that these financing flows and sources, one, are feasible, and number two, we can actually get them or attract them within the time frames in question. And then there's a third dimension of it, which is more around demand side accountability, where particularly for civil society, really pushing or driving some of the advocacy to ensure that both, climate change and the financing that are required, for Ghana in this instance, happens, because we are racing against time. And what has even made things even more onerous now is that we've got a fiscal crisis that we need to deal with. Last year, as of November, the debt to GDP is almost 95%. If the new numbers are released, certainly it's going to be over 100%, between 105 and 110% of our GDP. So basically, there's no room in that regard. But even within that, there are pockets or areas that we could possibly tap into locally to increase the financing sources. Okay, so the question then is, what has the government said or done in terms of what it wants to do about the climate issues? So every government in the world that is signatory to the Paris Agreement, in 2015, the global governments met and they agreed some set of protocols. What you do as a government is to come and say, okay, based on my understanding of the issues, these are the things that as Ghana or as Zambia or South Africa or Nigeria, I want to do to help address the climate issues. And what you do with that is to communicate it in a document that is called the Nationally Determined Contributions. So this is a report that Ghana or every country in the world would submit to the UNFFC, and it details specific areas that it wants to implement to help address this climate issue. So in 2020, we did our first submission in 2016, and then in 2020, we did an updated version of that report. But the bottom line here is that there are two broad areas that the government wants to invest in. Within mitigation, so help prevent the effects of climate change, and then adaptation, which is basically help communities and those that are affected, right, quote unquote, adapt to the already existing effects of that. And these areas here, I won't go through them, are the areas that the government wants to invest in. In all, there are 47 measures that the government has communicated in this NDC document, of which 13 are adaptation and 34 are mitigation in that. So by far, if you look at the monetary breakdown as well, I'll show it in a moment, you can see that most of the effort is actually directed towards mitigation, and largely also because that can or is often an investment-related activity, people bringing in money, and some FDI as well. And adaptation can be a bit tricky historically to fund from a private sector side of things in that regard. Okay, so let me quickly then show you a couple more numbers about the flows that have come in, and then we'll look at the Ghana flows, and then I will just wrap up by closing with some broad remarks for us to reflect on as we go into the plenary discussions. These are the flows that have been coming in over the last few years. You can strike an average, and that's probably just about 900 or so billion per annum. If you look at what is actually required at a global level to decarbonize, there are different numbers around that, but at the lower end of the estimate, we're looking at just about $130 trillion if we want to meet these climate goals or targets. For sub-Saharan Africa alone, between 2022 and 2030, we need around $2.8 trillion. If you take that and you break it down, these are big numbers, so I'll break it down. Every year, Africa alone needs just about 290 billion, right, to be able to finance that. Now, the economy of Ghana, for all its worth and for all the hula baloo, is just about 79 billion. So if you take 290 divided by your 79 or 80, we're talking almost a factor of about 3, right? Or maybe 4. So you need 4 times the GDP of Ghana every year to be able to finance the climate-related activities on the continent. And what actually has been coming in on the continent in the last few years has actually been about 12%, thereabout. So at the continental level, there's a big gap of about 85%, right? And then we'll look at Ghana as well, where the gap sort of sits. But largely, the monies have been coming in from a combination of private and the public sector. And if you break it down regionally, in Africa, most of the monies have been coming in from public sources. So your more multilaterals and your development finance institutions, you name it. You don't have as much private sector involvement as is possible. So one of the questions really is, how do we address the bottlenecks that would allow the private sector in a place like Ghana to actually able to thrive and finance some of these climate-related activities? And I already talked about this, but if you look at the breakdown by region in the world and where the sources are coming from, you can see in many places you have a fairly even split of financing between domestic and international. But in Africa, given our precarious fiscal challenges, you see that often the financing sources have been coming in from or coming in externally, right? In that regard. And again, a point of reflection here is in the context of the ongoing war, Russia-Ukraine, and in the context of the aftermath of COVID, if you look at the recent assessment done by the IMF, the World Bank, and other bodies, many of the countries that have been classified as being highly vulnerable in terms of exposure to debt distress, so overall debt, but also external debt distress, many of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a new call or a push to actually get African countries or sub-Saharan African countries to get new debt relief or debt reprieve in the form of climate for debt swaps. So basically the idea is that if, let's say, Ghana owes, so the conversation that's going on with the 3 billion IMF program, and the IMF says that Ghana has got to go and get financing assurances from its external creditors. The idea would be that you would, for example, sit down with the Chinese or sit down with your Paris Club members and say, well, instead of paying the interest on these debt to you, rather we would rechannel a portion of that and invest it into climate-related activities. And that conversation is actually gaining quite a lot of momentum in recent times. And again, the other issue is that, and this pertains to Ghana as well, if you look at the monies that are even coming in, so we said, or I said that only about 12% of the flows have been coming into Africa. If you break it down further into the structure or the type of flow, again, most of it is coming in the form of, these are debt instruments, right? So given the dire state of public finances in many of our countries, this is already going to add on to the existing debt crisis or challenges that many countries face, and Ghana is not excluded in this regard. So same story here in terms of the breakdown between debt and equity and the grant. So let me wrap it up with the Ghana story, and again bombard you with some numbers around that. So I said that all the countries submit this nationally determined contribution or NDC statement. And Ghana submitted one, or the latest one, back in 2020. Now, if you look at that document, the government provides an estimate of how much it needs to be able to meet all those 47 measures that are listed in there. And they give a range, right, of between 9 and about 16 billion. So if you do the average of that, that's roughly, I think, about 12 billion, right? So Ghana needs 12 billion to be able to finance all of these related activities. The challenge is that if you actually work it out as a proportion of what we even owe, that's roughly 32% of our current, right, debt stock as of November last year, or 16% of our 2021, right, GDP. So again, let me break it down. If you take your 2022 to 2030, that's what, 9 years, right, in total. And if you take your average of your 12 billion, then basically means every year as a country, we need to find $1.4 billion to finance our climate activities. So that's about half of what we're currently looking from the IMF for our bailout, right? Or to put it in other terms, last week, PIAC released the 2022 report on Ghana's oil revenues. And in 2022, we earned just about 1.5 billion of revenue from our share or entitlement of the oil and gas that we export from Ghana. So again, if you want a simple analogy to compare these two, this 1.4 billion that we need every year between now and 2030 to finance our climate-related activities under the NDC is equivalent to all of the revenues that we just got from the export or our share of oil and gas from last year. That's how big, the gap is, and what we need to raise. The challenge is, if you look at the data between 2011 and 2019, what we have actually accrued, or we had accrued, amounted to about 163 million USD per year. And I think for if there are representatives from the Ministry of Finance here, and they have more recent data, it would be nice to get some comment from there. But I don't think this number has changed that much. So remember, we need 1 point what? Oh, please help me. We need how much? 1.4. Okay. How much have we mobilized so far, about on average? 163. So what's the gap? Oh, no. I know it's huge, but let's quantify it. What's the gap? It's still in excess of 1 billion, pretty much, isn't it? Okay. So question is, how are we going to plug this loophole or this gap in that regard? And this is where I think this conversation is quite important, because even when we were not in a fiscal crisis as such, we still had a big deficit, almost 163 divided by 1.4. That's probably, I suspect, we're only mobilizing just about 20% or so, right, of those inflows. So we need to look at ways around that. And again, if you break down the inflows of that 163, a big chunk of it came in the form of some grants, and then there are some loans as well, and some coming from the budget itself. But it's about how do we get more of these grants, and how do we get, you can argue, less loans, because then that imposes an undue burden on the public finances of the country. And where the monies have come from, most of it has been through multilateral and through bilateral channels. And again, the private sector contribution is fairly negligible. It's just about 3%. I'd love to see this number go up to maybe about 15, 20%. And the question is how that can be attained. So I'm just painting a picture so that when we get into the plenary, we can, use this to frame some of the deep conversations that we would have. And again, if you look at where the monies have been channeled into, by far the biggest is gone into mitigation. In the updated NDC, I said there are 47 actions, 34 of them are mitigation related. But an argument could be made here that, look, a number of our communities are already facing the effects of these climate-related activities in the north and even here in the south, where there's a lot of coastal erosion and you name it. And so this 5% number must necessarily go up in that regard. And most of the money is gone into the energy sector, particularly I think we count also the gas-related investments that have been made over that period, and hence why you've got about 61% of the mitigation-related flows going into the energy sector. For adaptation, it's gone into all sorts of places, but the biggest is you've got agriculture and some education in that regard. My last couple of slides, and I'll wrap up. So I talked about the fact that the government itself also has to put something down, or you may say it needs to have skin in the game. So how much has the government been allocating to support climate-related activities in the country, right? The benchmark, if you look at the budgetary allocations, is that on average, the government has this 1.4 billion target themselves, but basically it means that we have to allocate 175 million per year. But if you track, and this is an interesting report I encourage everyone to look at, the Ministry of Finance actually publishes an SDG budget report. If you track the flows in the last few years, yes, it's gone up, but it's nowhere near what the government itself must be allocating to support climate activity. And even remember that this one is CDSO, it's not dollars, right? So if you convert it to dollars, the number would actually be much smaller. And if you again break it down, where the monies have been coming from historically as a country, some of it, and this is a positive for me, that, okay, despite all the constraints, we're still getting some IGFs at the ministry, department, and agency level to commit to climate activities, but that needs to be substantially increased to be able to meet that 1.4 billion per year target. There are a number of potential avenues that we probably should start thinking or availing our minds to. And some of these instruments here was even subject to extensive consultations in a session that I participated in last week. But to address the financing shortfalls, we've got two existing tax instruments: the plastic tax that was introduced far back in 2013, and the fund has actually allocated or been accrued in excess of 1 billion Ghana cedi. However, it's not been utilized, and part of the reason is that there's meant to be a certain legislative instrument that should be passed to give effect to the setup of an authority to spend the fund. And of course, there's also another question of, even if it has accrued in excess of 1 billion, is that money actually there, right? I'm sure it's somewhere in the consolidated fund and it's been swallowed. But that is not to say that if we get the authority or the governing instrument to give mandate to this, then of course the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury would have to reallocate those monies back into this fund. But $1 billion Ghana cedis is still something that we can tap into, and even more as we reform this tax and even include other plastic products into the mix. There's also the famous, or you may say infamous, sanitation and pollution levy that was introduced just a few years ago. And the numbers indicate that in 2021, we had accrued just under 265 million Ghana, and about half of that amount as of June 2022. So if you do the projections and say you get 265 plus even the same, then we're talking almost about 600 million Ghana cedi cumulatively in the space of about 2 years. And again, there are proposals here around how you can, again, better target and restructure this tax handle to allocate some more monies towards the climate-related efforts. Then the two, in my view, you may argue more controversial ones are the thing to do with reforming fossil fuel subsidies. So for some of the things that we buy, so for example, residual fuel oil, RFO, which is used in industry, and also premix, for example, these ones are subsidized by government under the automatic pricing sort of adjustment formula. The argument has been made in certain quarters that for premix, for example, is diverted and never get to the people who actually need it. So isn't it perhaps time to think about rechanneling some of those subsidies towards climate-related effort, even if the monies are still going into the coastal communities? Then there's also the issue of carbon pricing and emissions trading, which again, Prof mentions. The only concern here really is that if you set the price of carbon and you're asking your industries to pay for it, in an environment where you have high taxes, you've got high inflation, and these guys are already struggling to compete with import from China and other places, then it could actually end up further denting the competitiveness of your local industries, however good the aspirations are. Nevertheless, I think there are opportunities on the trading side of things where we've got huge forest resources, and particularly the likes of the voluntary carbon markets and the regulated market can become quite interesting. There's an example of what Gabon is trying to do recently. So Gabon produces a lot of oil. Their GDP is just about 11 or 12 billion, but they also sit on one of the world's biggest rainforest reserves. And they are looking at raising about $2 billion from the international carbon markets. So 2 billion divided by 11 billion, that's quite a big number. Almost about maybe it won't be a quarter, a little bit below, about 20% of their entire GDP to raise or selling carbon credit and carbon offsets to be able to finance their climate-related, efforts. So, with all this said and done, I think there are 5 questions that I would want us to reflect on as we get into the plenary. The first one really is, from where you sit or the institution that you represent, what policy solutions can we or be implemented to minimize the financing risks that I had highlighted in relation to Ghana? Number 2, what policy measures can be implemented to accelerate domestic climate finance? So currently we're just getting just around, about 3 or so % that I highlighted. But we want to get more flows from our domestic sources. So what can we do to stimulate or to accelerate this domestic financing flows? Number 3, what tax or fiscal measures can be implemented to, again, secure the financing needed to address the climate issues in Ghana amidst the ongoing crisis? And I was even reflecting on this, and I wondered, with the whole IMF talk and the conversations, whether we've been pushing to get things like, debt reprieve or debt for nature swaps as part of the financing mix within that. Number 4, how can financial institutions increase the climate finance solutions to support climate smart enterprises? This I'm particularly excited about, because here is where the innovation and here's where the value chain related activities could actually take place and create far more jobs and be able to address some of the unemployment situation in the country. And then the 5th one, we've been going for these COP events almost every year. There's one coming up later this year in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai, Dubai. So again, how can Ghana, and you can extend it, how can Africa present a united front to accelerate climate financing through their participation in the annual UN Conference of the Parties, COP? So these are 5, you may say, big questions, but I am hoping that by the time we leave here, we would have found some solutions to that. And then, of course, our job as IMANI and as civil society is to further fine-tune these and engage some of the stakeholders some more and present them as policy recommendations and use that to drive the advocacy effort going forward. So with that said, I want to thank you all very much, and my apologies for going over my time. I didn't realize.
Thank you very much. Let's put our hands together once again.
You're forgiven, Dr. Champong. So Dr. Champong has also outlined some of the questions that we expected to answer this morning together. And then, likewise, we had Dr. Boateng also raising quite a number of them. So Ghana is highly vulnerable, but not ready to address climate-related activities. That's on the table. Are we ready? Now, he referred to the COP, or the COPs that we have been attending. Last year when we had the first session, it was just right after the COP27. Unfortunately, the EPA Chief Executive Officer was seated right opposite me, like his colleague here. And then he mentioned that he had the opportunity to meet with President Biden of the United States. And one of the things he has advocated for is some monies that we are going to see. We are going to look at how some of these monies are coming in, if indeed they are coming in. Because Doc again also mentioned that we have fiscal crisis as a country, and everybody can see that. We are also running to IMF for 3 billion, yet we are looking for 1.4 billion every year to finance climate change. Are we ready for this? Can we afford this? We are slapping the private sector with a lot of taxes, 3 taxes more, yet we want to encourage them to be able to contribute. So far, they are doing just about 2.8%. Doc says that he wants to see them do about 18%. How do we encourage the private sector to also contribute? Again, we want to create awareness among government. We want to create awareness among civil society. How do we do all of these things? These are the things that are going to be on the table for the next hour or 2 or so. I will not be able to allow everybody mention their names here because we have quite a large number today compared to what we had the last time. However, I will attempt to, acknowledge the institutions that are present, and then I will introduce also the panel that will start the conversation. But as a matter of fact, all of us are going to engage in this particular subject. We have in our midst, and I would love that at the end of the day we put our hands together for them for the good job that they've done as far as this program is concerned. Oxfam is with us, Energy Commission is here, the US Embassy is here, Canada High Commission is here, Cocoa Board is here, Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources, the European Union Development Bank Ghana is here, also representatives from the Daily Guide, that's from the media, Metro Television, Daily Graphic, Ghanaian Times, Oman FM, TV Africa, Class FM, and News Ghana. Other representations are from Environmental Protection Agency, the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation, Ghana Climate Innovation Center, expecting, okay, we already have Foster, so the Ministry of Finance is seated also, and Foster took a lot of blows the last time. I'm sure that today will even be worse. The way Doc has started punching, even from the pulpit, that's another matter. Also have representatives from Mali Embassy, the British High Commission, the United Nations Development Program, that's the UNDP, and CDD Ghana. Let's put our hands together for everybody, please. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have 4 institutions represented by very distinguished individuals to start the line of conversations that we all want to have today, and hopefully have answers to everything that Doc raised, Dr. Champong and Dr. Boateng have raised here, plus many more that would come from some of you as well. From Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation, if you can introduce yourselves there.
Hello, good morning. My name is Jima Mohammed. I'm a Deputy Director and the Head of Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology and Innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's put our hands together for him. Also from Environmental Protection Agency, we have a representative. Can we have your introduction, sir?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Lamte, and I work with the Climate Change Unit of the Environmental Protection Agency as a Principal Program Officer. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Let's put our hands together for him. The Ghana Climate Innovative Center is represented. Let's have introduction.
Hi, my name is Dramani Bukari. I work with the Ghana Climate Innovation Center. Our parent institution is Asseshi University. I am the lead for partnerships, investments, and entrepreneurship. Thank you so much.
Let's put our hands together for Gariba. Good. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we also have representations from Ministry of Sanitation. Let's put our hands together for Ministry of Sanitation. Are they here, Ministry of Sanitation? Shall we see by hand? Good. Thank you. So now our assignment for... Okay. Okay. Let's put our hands together for the representative for Ministry of Finance and have him introduce himself first.
Thank you very much. Like you said, Sammy, this time you'll not get the time to bully me because I have a strong team here. My name is Foster Wajijemfi, and I'm here with a very important person, Abna Techua. Abna, She's at the back. She's the special advisor to the Minister of Finance, and I'm sure this time around we get to respond to every question.
So we'll spread the punches, don't worry. Abna, thank God you're also seated far end there so that those there can just fire you from that angle. Ghana is highly vulnerable but not ready to address. Environmental Protection Agency, are we ready to address climate-related activities?
Great, thank you for your question. And I'd like to start from where he ended his presentation and give a snapshot of what we are doing to be able to address Ghana's vulnerability. Just to start, I like that he gave a presentation on what, Ghana's efforts to address mitigation and adaptation issues to be able to ensure that we are resilient against climate change. But I would like to also acknowledge that my minister here, I've been in the person of Mohammed anyway. So I would like to also add that we work together as a team. We work closely with Foster, Dramani, everyone here. So I'm sure when it gets to them, they may fill in the gaps where I may not have addressed it accurately. But just to start off the conversation, I would like to also indicate that we reckon that we are very vulnerable to climate change. And I like the fact that the presentation highlighted the fact that Ghana's emission is, or Africa's emission is negligible when you look at the global emissions. But however, we see climate change as an opportunity for the private sector and as an opportunity for us to be able to develop and not using the same trajectory that our developed parties or countries have developed using, but rather to develop in a more sustainable way that we may be able to even do better and take advantage of the opportunities and the lessons and the challenges that exist. We don't want to contribute to the problem because we will suffer more. But in addressing the challenges, I also want to indicate the fact that the presentation highlighted some carbon pricing instrument that you can deploy to pay for the social cost of some of the emissions or the rising global emissions. And that's one of the strategies that we have adopted to be able to finance our NDCs. And in doing that, we conducted an assessment on the carbon price instrument that we can deploy to pay for some of these emissions. And then we looked at 3 options. That is a carbon tax, the emission trading scheme, that's the ETS that he made mention of, and then also the carbon crediting mechanism. And the findings were very, very interesting. And so he informed us on the approach to take. So in terms of coming up or the findings, we realized that the heavy polluters are heavily taxed, as Dr. Boateng and Dr. Champon highlighted. Again, we realized that we have the infrastructure to adopt the carbon tax or the emission trading scheme, but we realized that we're going to face a huge political risk in terms of implementing these 2 options. So we took the approach of the carbon crediting mechanism, and that's what you hear as a carbon market. So as we decided on the carbon market, maybe Mohammed would, I don't know if he would speak on that. I mean, maybe I'm also taking the position of a moderator here, but I won't go into that. But the carbon market, what we have done so far is to create a framework, because this market is one that relies on perception. So how do you create certainty and transparency processes to foster and grow this market? So what we have done is to come up with a framework, as I said, and the framework provides an institutional framework. It itemizes the processes and procedures for creating carbon assets and for transfer, and also it highlights Ghana's participation requirements. So I would like to end here, and then if there are any other areas that I didn't cover, you may bring my attention to it and I'll address them. Thank you.
Okay, just wanted to, just a follow-up on this one, and if you please be a bit slightly audible. Okay. I'm told that those at the back can hardly hear you. So have we been able to make some gains out of some of those innovations that you mentioned?
Okay, thank you. We have made, I don't know if you can hear me well now, but we have made substantial gains in this fight. And I must say that Ghana is leading in the implementation of carbon markets worldwide, and we are the front runners, and people are actually learning from us. So we just received a delegation from Namibia to understudy what we are doing in relation to the carbon market. And I must say that what we have done is to develop the framework to be able to take advantage of 3 markets that are present under the UNFCCC protocols, right? That is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we have created the rules around the first market, which is Article 6.2, also known as the cooperative approaches. And then the second one is known as, or mimics the CDM market, but it's quite different, and it's called Article 6.4. What we have done is to develop we currently have about almost 12 projects under development and at different stages of development. And I must say that we are doing this together with non-state and state actors. So that is what I have to share. Thank you.
Okay, but are these leading to some numbers, tangible numbers that we can get?
Okay, yes. To just provide you some figures in relation to what we are doing with just the government of Switzerland. So under Article 6.2, it looks at creating the conditions with a participating party. So here Ghana is working with the government of Switzerland, government of Sweden, government of Singapore, South Korea, and we just received notification from the UAE that want to also cooperate with us under that. But in terms of our arrangement with the government of Switzerland, the investment that we are seeing is about $500 million US dollars over the 7-year period that we have for the implementation.
500 million
US dollars. So
okay.
If you add what the others will be doing, then we are sure to be able to raise the investment to meet what we are looking at under the conditional measures. Thank you.
Okay. Mo, from policy side, you also want to paint a picture of vulnerability and also tell us if there are some innovative ways we are getting numbers in addition to what?
Yes, just to take off from what Daniel, who we copied through, has indicated. When Dr. Ajiman made his presentation, we all understood that Ghana, Dr. Chambo, sorry, from now to 2030, we need about 9.3 billion to implement the NDCs. But we must also note that the NDCs that we submitted, the financial aspect is broken down into 2 different components, right? We have what we call the unconditional component and then the conditional component. Now, the unconditional component is the part of the NDCs that we think government of Ghana can implement on its own without any financial support from external parties. And these unconditional factors, again, are the actions within the NDCs that at the time we were submitting to the UNFCCC, we had either mobilized funding fully for its implementation or partially. So the 3.5 billion out of the 9.5 billion are actions that we have indicated that they are ones that we either have the money available or we have part of the money and we are looking for another part, right? Then the second component, which is the conditional, where we indicated that we will need support from external sources to be able to implement, is only about 5.3 billion, right? So let me come to the unconditional one, where we said we've either mobilized money partially or fully to implement them. Just to give you examples of them. One of the actions we indicated that we were going to look into coastal protection along Ghana's coast. I'm sure we've all heard about what is happening in Kita, which is very worrying, and we have to address that. Now in the NDCs, at the time we estimated about $500 million dollars to implement coastal protection programs. As we are sitting here with the support of World Bank and other partners, we now have almost about $250 million secured to do that. Another one, which was also an unconditional action, is what we call the post-harvest losses. You know, in agric, we also understand that we have a lot of losses because we don't have proper post-harvest management practices. And so if you look at Ministry of Agric One District, One Warehouse program, which so far has established about 56 warehouses across different districts in the country. This is also one of the programs that we captured under the unconditional. Another one is looking at the forest plantation program. I'm sure all of us is aware of the Green Ghana project, right? Which now is almost implemented every year. Last year, I understand government spent almost about $20 million to implement this. This is also one of the actions. So in terms of internal resource mobilization to implement the unconditional one, it's not that bad. But if you don't have the figures, then it will look like, okay, we are running into fire, right? I'll come back again under the context that we are now facing some financial issues with IMF and what have you. So how do we then go forward to fill the gap in this 3.4 billion, right? Because then the 5.4 billion, which is part of this, we had indicated clearly that without external support, we will either not do anything about it and leave it the way it is. So for the external one, as Pedro indicated, Daniel, right? We've identified a couple of innovative solutions that we'll use to implement them. That's the conditional one. And I think a couple of the measures, as we mentioned, we look at the resource-based payment system. We're looking at the multilateral funds like from the GCF, the JEF. We're also looking at grants from private sector institutions and philanthropists, and also green concessional loans. We're also looking at green bonds and then the climate market that Pedro spoke about. And also, he also made mention of what you call the debt swap for climate action. I think Dr. Ajiman Achampon, right, already spoke to it. So again, going back to the Sweden one, as he indicated, we are so far implementing about 13 projects. We are looking at sustainable rice production. We are looking at waste recycling and composting. We are looking at solar PVs in institutions and also clean cooking projects. He indicated that at least from the Switzerland side, we are looking at mobilizing about $500 million, right? Singapore is there, Sweden is there, Korea is there, and the UAE is also coming on board. So all this together, right? And also bringing on board the other support from the Climate Trust Funds. We hope and we believe that we'll be able to implement the NDCs without any hitch going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mo. But just a quick follow-up. So have we been able to sum all these inflows and know the amount that we are having? And are we able to place them under the amount that we are dedicating for, say, mitigation and the amount that we are dedicating for adaptation? So you referenced Keta, for instance. Is that, and you talked about the 250 million that we've been able to mobilize for that. Are we placing that, all of that into adaptation for Keta? Because they're already suffering some of those, or how much is going into mitigation for that?
Okay, so I've given him that work. He's doing it. He has not completed. He's
Okay.
supposed to report to me by the end of next month.
So that's his assignment at the
Yes,
office?
Yes, at the office.
Okay,
But just
because I
to-
felt this is policy and I wanted that detail
yes,
from
but
you.
Just to go to the Kita issue, right? Apart from the sea defense lines, we're also looking at nature-based solutions, right? For example, how do we improve upon mangroves along the coast to ensure that they prevent erosion or inward movement of the sea? You know, mangrove is also a nature-based solution that addresses mitigation issues. So for some of these projects, we are not looking at them like adaptation per se, but there are mitigation co-benefits that are associated with each of them. The funding, then we can now break it down to individual components, and then we can come out clearly that, oh, out of this money, we have this for adaptation mitigation. When I was speaking, I made mention about a program we are looking on sustainable rice production. Someone will ask me, how does rice come into climate change mitigation issues? The way we produce rice, everybody understands that you need to allow a lot of water to stand in the rice farm before the rice does well. It's a lie.
That's not the way.
No. And when you are in the rice farm, you see that there are some bubbles on the surface of the water. You think that it's just air, but it's not air, it's methane, right? So if we are able to introduce technologies in the rice farms that makes them adapt to water usage, one, and also remove the methane that is generated, then we are looking at both adaptation and mitigation. So for each of the actions that we are implementing, we are not looking at them in isolation like this is adaptation, this is mitigation, but we look at them to ensure that in each of them there's a benefit to adaptation and there's a benefit to mitigation. And like I said, he has been given that assignment to complete.
Okay.
And when it is ready, we can share the report with you.
Okay, let me come to Ministry of Finance. Foster, in terms of financing, we've talked about the fact, and there have been concerns about the fact that you've already slapped taxes onto the private sector, yet we're expecting them to contribute, and their contribution from Dr. Champong says that it's very negligible, 2.8%. Where are we getting the rest of the money from? The last time Mr. Kukufu, Dr. Kukufu, mentioned that he was part of the team that raised the placard at COP27, and the money was coming. Do we have some money coming in? Where else are we getting other monies? Do we have some innovations that are bringing in money? Tell us.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much. Having heard the Ministry of Environment, do I have to talk again?
You are the pest. You have the money.
What I think they've said it all. In terms of the 9.3 to 15.5 billion, the strategy is very clear. It's much specific as compared to the initial NDC. And like I said the other time, we're in a hurry, we needed to submit something, but this time it's well targeted. In terms of how we're going to get this done, a lot has been said, but most strategic of these is that now we're going to do much of the homegrown, get ourselves involved, because I'm not sure somebody will be able to help us resolve the issue of climate change. We have to do it ourselves. And we're going to do it in two ways. Like Mohammed indicated, the domestic first, then when it's beyond us, we're going to look at the external because we never caused it. According to the IPPC report, we never caused it. It's out of industrialization. But then, because we are vulnerable, we need to get ourselves prepared. We need to also contribute our quota so that at least we can get there. Before I respond to your issue about how we're going to get a private sector on board, I think it's very important we know that we are vulnerable in two ways. First, the infrastructure, and the second, the resources. If we don't put in place the needed infrastructure, we'll suffer the most, because if we are hit by drought, flood, and all those things, we may not survive because we don't have the financing to be able to put ourselves back like the advanced country and the global north. That is why currently the ministry, Ghana is leading the charge under the climate, the CVF, that's a climate vulnerable forum, and the Ministry of Finance is leading also, is chairing the vulnerable 20, and let me say, it's not 20 states. Now we have more members, and we are leading it in a very strategic way, and my minister is getting a lot, not only for Ghana. One of the things that we're doing under the vulnerable strategy is putting up a climate prosperity plan. So now we are not looking at just climate, we are looking beyond climate. So that is why I said we are vulnerable in two aspects, the infrastructure and also the resources. So having said that, what is the climate prosperity plan? It's looking at how we can be able to galvanize, get proposals, and be able to assess financing in a very innovative way that will not cause the national payers so much. Like you mentioned, a lot of the funding that are coming in are concessional or debt, and now we also have issue of debt to resolve. So working with the various agencies, we putting up this prosperity plan and getting a number of proposals to be able to respond to that. Now, having said that, in terms of the climate, is it climate what? Debt swap or what? Or nature's, nature for what? Debt for nature swap. We have already taken the lead and having discussions with all the possible financiers, and the IMF is a key example. The current spring meeting that just ended last week, there was a strong call by the Minister of Finance for that instrument, and therefore I'm sure in the shortest future we will see the country taking advantage of that. Carbon markets, a lot has been said about it, but apart from those countries that have been mentioned, I also wish to say that the United States, we've had discussions with them and are interested. Other countries have also shown interest. Canada has shown interest, and therefore there's some, I'm sure there'll be some warm-up, and we'll engage the appropriate quarters, the Ministry of Environment and EPA. Apart from this, I'm sure we are also aware that the country has developed, led by the Ministry of Finance, developed the sustainable financing framework that is going to help us to be able to tap into the green bond instrument. I know currently it's on hold. We're looking at other factors to be in our favor before we can take advantage of that. The other thing that has been happening that we haven't mentioned so much is what is happening within our subnational level. And when I say this, under the local project, a lot is going on, and the districts are implementing a resilient infrastructure project to be able to ensure that at least we can withstand. I talked about the infrastructure. So under the EU support, this one is not a debt, it's a grant we're receiving, and currently we've received notification that additional funding is coming to support that area. We're going to take advantage of this to be able to leverage additional from the GCF, and I'm sure it's going to help the subnational level. And talking about the subnational level, under the climate prosperity plan, we want to look at it in two ways: how we can make impact on the ground, and how we can also look at the national level, how we can have a lot of effect at the national level with bigger projects. There are a lot of bigger projects that are coming, and I'm sure when they commence, we will know. Under the Green Climate Fund, it's good to also know that we are hitting about 500 million, and this is coming from about 11 projects in various categories. Funding proposals are 6. We also have project preparatory also from the Green Climate Fund, then readiness to build capacity and also to support in the development of projects. And the 6 projects that we've gotten approval from the Green Climate Fund, a number of them are also regional in nature. We going to implement those projects with some neighboring countries such as Nigeria, Mali, and so on and so forth. So currently, the current one that was approved, about 270 million, is going to support resilient infrastructure at the Takoradi port. Also, we are expecting another approval very soon, also to be looking at how we can get the agri sector to be smart, because within the era of climate change, we need to survive. Within the era of climate change, we need to ensure that our energy is kept on. So we're looking at how we can beef up and also be able to meet the target that we set ourselves to be able to get our energy mix 10% coming from renewables, working on that. So we're looking at a solar project with the Green Climate Fund, which, if approved very soon, looking at the board, the B35, that's the board meeting that is yet to come on in July.
Okay.
Now, having said that, Sammy, before maybe I come, having said that, there's some money that has come in. The Climate Investment Fund, 100 million has come in. Also, you asked the question when the last time we came and we made noise. Through those noise, the US has provided a 1 billion to the Green Climate Fund for adaptation. Through those noise at the COP, the US has provided 300 million for adaptation.
Sorry, just to be specific, provided means giving you that money.
No, I'm saying the US have provided 1 billion to the Green Climate Fund for adaptation intervention. So which means gone are the days we struggle with getting adaptation funding from the Green Climate Fund. Now there's opportunity to tap into that. Again, in various levels, the US have made some money. We need to take advantage of it and be able to move on. Now, lastly, when I talked about homegrown, what I meant is that we, sitting here, we as a country need to do our bit. And this is the time to do it, not the future. We need to contribute. And currently, we're developing this a mimic of the Green Climate Fund, Ghana Green Fund, where we're going to mobilize funding from all angles. The private sector would contribute, everybody will contribute, so that we can be able to support. And in the climate arena, when we talk about climate finance, we are not talking about the same old funding. We are talking about new and additional.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. But just a quick follow-up on that. I also read or heard somewhere that we had gotten some $3 million from the World Bank as around November last year. Is it true?
So there are a number of projects with the World Bank. The 300 million we're looking
particularly for communities, climate change. Yeah.
That's what I'm coming to. There are a number of funding coming from the World Bank. The 300 million, when approved, will trigger in. Again, the World Bank, through the resource base under the forest, we got also some money from there. Some community money has come, as you've mentioned. So there are a lot of money coming in. The most important thing is for us to strategically position ourselves as communities, as entrepreneurs, as CSOs, to be able to access this funding. Thank you.
For financial institutions, what are you doing to draw them in, as far as climate smart enterprises and creating a lot of innovations for you and making money out of them?
I wish Abna would have started and add up. Abna will start, then you add up. So there's been a lot of engagement with the private sector, and I must say, sometimes it's unfortunate we engage, but these engagements sometimes, the approach by the private sector is sometimes worrying. We've been engaging the private sector as far as back 2016. I myself even organized a forum for them. I've now organized one, I think a year or two ago. We've been engaging them up. Beyond that, we've been engaging them bilaterally. But what government has done is to be able to access some funding and make them available to some of the banks. So for example, under the SunRep program, 2 banks have started, Car Bank and Ghana Commercial Bank. Some 20 million euros being made available for renewable. Again, under the KFW, 30 million. 3 banks have been selected, EcoBank, ADB, and some other banks. They went through the process. In the same arena, The Development Bank is also being supported to be able to tap into the green space. But having said this, through the leadership of the central bank, the sustainable banking principle is being implemented. And I want to say that gone are the days we needed to force them. Now, all the financial institutions are going green, not just the national institutions, at the global level. And if the IMF and the World Bank are now looking at green financing and all that, then it tells you that we can no longer wait. We need to strategically embrace ourselves for it. So the financial institutions have been engaged. They are being supported.
Okay.
We are also leading them to the right quarters to be able to access the needed green finance and to be able to make them available. Before I end, out of the 6 funding proposals that we have received from the GCF, that's the Green Climate Fund, one of them is will be made available to EcoBank to be offloaded to SMEs, and the focus is women, strategically, and well targeted.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dramani. I'm going to invite you, having heard from and you are coming from a private sector, so having heard from the state agencies and what they have plans and all of that, how do you think this country can accelerate climate finance through participation in the annual conferences plus all the other innovations that we're talking about?
Well, thank you very much, Sami. And okay, great, thank you. Thank you so very much, Sami. Well, it's interesting listening to my colleagues. The picture which is being painted appear to seem that we are complaining about something that is a non-issue. I struggle very deeply to accept that. And the reason I struggle very deeply to accept that is the fact that if you speak to small and growing businesses overall, regardless of the sector in which they are operating in, and regardless of whether or not they are responding to climate change, you get a sense that access to finance remain a challenge. The most recent statistics I have seen still suggest that credit to GDP ratio is still very low from the commercial banking or from financial institutions generally in Ghana, still at around about 11%. You would also find that many of the private sector, much of government borrowing, is in the capital market. In that process, crowding out and making it difficult for the private sector to access funding. You would also find that much of our banks, while they do have an appetite for sustainability, find it extremely difficult to follow that through. And the reason is that there is no appropriate policy mandating them to do so. In other words, they are having to do so on their own accord. And so for me, some level of policy tightening will be important to ensure that there are clear-cut guidelines supporting a system that allows for financial institutions to report along those lines. And some institutions ought to be tracking that. I also want to say that fiscal policy remain one area. Okay, so first of all, because of where we stand in terms of debt burden, many of the plans that government has had in terms of money that we expect to be coming through might not be coming through because of the debt distress. And so my colleague here must have mentioned so many mitigation and adaptation finances which they had anticipated will come through. They may likely not come through because government on one hand is unable, does not have the fiscal space again to go into some capital markets to go and borrow, and so the money will not come. And it then means that they will have to rely on concessional funds. Concessional funds, again, to what extent are we able to do that? Because again, that also adds on to some level of debt. We will have to look at alternatives. That comes to debt to nature swaps. The question you ask yourself is, what is the quantum of our debt that is owed to bilaterals? If the sizable quantum of our debt is owed to bilaterals, it makes it a lot more easy to apply debt to nature swaps. But if it is owed to multiple parties, within the Paris Club, it's also a lot more easier. But if it's owed to corporates, and that is where we have actually, that's where we got most of our debt components was accumulated from the international capital market, from commercial capital market, that are not public funding. So how do you now, ensure that you benefit from a debt to nature swap when your debt is owed to the commercials? Immediately that you go and you want to arrange a debt to nature swap with those commercials, it's going to be very difficult. You need a third party, like maybe the African Development Bank, and if the Ghana Development Bank is open to it, they act as the trustee. They then purchase that debt as a discount rate, and then that allows you that opportunity to be able to do that. We do not have any kind of institution like that at this moment. We do not know whether the Development Bank of Ghana is willing to take up that position. The African Development Bank, in their own reports, have indicated willingness to open up that opportunity to African countries that are willing to go on that route. But again, it comes with some level of consequences if we have to go through that, because then we are going to be further downgraded, and all of that, and that speaks about how we are going to recover. And so it's a bit of a very murky situation where we've difficult position we find ourselves. Okay. And so it's good to give hope, but I think that we need to tread cautiously and be a little realistic about that. If you ask me, from where I come from, there are a number of things that we can do to support the financial sector. We have credit guarantees, if you ask me, as one of the things that government should be looking at. And I think the institution now better placed to do that will be the Development Bank of Ghana. How can the Development Bank of Ghana, for instance, develop a credit guarantee instrument that allows for the banking sector in Ghana, or financial institutions in Ghana, to fund climate smart businesses, for instance, so that eventually they have some level of partial protection from any defaults that may occur in the future. We are having that for the agricultural sector in the nature of the Ghana incentive-based risk sharing for agricultural lending. Could the Development Bank of Ghana then expand that, to other sectors? The other thing is, we are seeing Galamsey and the consequences that it is having on nature. Question is, how could we ensure that players within that sector, ring fence some kind of financing. Some financing from them is ring fenced to the extent that that can then be used to support innovations by climate innovation enterprises, to be able to ensure that we, beyond just reclamation and all of those things, that they go to fund innovations that eventually are able to protect us from the perspective of climate adaptation and mitigation. I mean,
Bukari, I'm going to push you to do a minute landing.
Okay, great. Now we are talking about tax, and we have this sanitation tax, we have the plastic tax and all of those things. Question is, how are you going to utilize the proceeds of those funds? Will they go into supporting climate innovations going into the future? Because eventually that will stand to strengthen our resilience going into the future. And for me, those are the kinds of things that we should be looking at. Thankfully, taxation or environmental tax, it seems to have very little consequences in terms of its effect on GDP and consumption generally, compared to corporate or income tax. Now, income tax, as we all know, has consequences because it can even reduce levels of consumption, okay? And once that happens, it has consequential impacts on, how much of demand we have out there for corporate output, and then how much our economy can grow over time. And so for me, all of those are considerations that we should have. They are low-hanging fruits, and I think that's where we need to be looking at. The big-ticket investments, I believe we should be working with multilaterals in terms of securing, concessional loans or grants, if we can have that, to be able to fund those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I might come back to you again for additional input on that, but I'm happy to also let you know that you mentioned them, and they are indeed here. The Ghana Development Bank is here. It will be interesting to also find out from them how they are sourcing funds, and if they are targeting the critical sectors like the small and medium enterprises that we're talking about. We'll hear from them shortly. I think they will be the next that I'll hand my microphone to. But there are quite a number of things that I would also want you to pick on. For instance, Dr. Dramani talked about the debt to nature swap. You may want to take his concerns and address it if necessary. He also was worried about the fact that you are expecting so much, yet you owe so much. On what grounds are you sure that these monies are going to come in? The representative from Ghana Development Bank, do we see you? Can we see you, please? Just raise your hands. Good. Can you help us with how we source funds? And if they are, or you are targeting critical sectors, that includes the small and medium enterprises. After that, I'll come back to Dr. Champong and Dr. Boating again, and the rest. We can all start asking questions. I see some of the innovators around as well, so we'll hear from everyone before we leave.
Okay, thank you. Well, so my name is John Boating Kwakuteria. I'm responsible for ESG, sustainability, and climate finance at the Development Bank Ghana. I think we've heard a lot today, and your question as to how we are doing this, how we are mobilizing climate financing. I'll just go straight to the point. So I'll just go straight to the point. I've heard what Abubakari is saying, Dramani is saying. So yes, we are barely 2 years, and what we've been doing is currently we are trying to respond to mobilizing climate financing by exploring how we're going to set up a DBG Green Climate Fund, which is not a fund, but it's a program, right? So under our funding with the World Bank, we have a line of credit. That what we're doing is that we are required to use 5% of that line of credit to finance small, medium enterprises that are into climate mitigation and adaptation projects or businesses. So our mandate is working with our financial intermediaries to deploy capital. So what we're doing, we are using an innovative way, using the earmarked funds to set up as a seed fund so that we create a base so that we can be able to mobilize additional funding using that seed capital. So yes, we are currently onboarding. We have almost about 5 banks so far that we've been able to onboard. They are Cal Bank, Fidelity, CBG, EcoBank, APSA, Access, and Zenith. I think there are 7. So what we are doing is that we've developed what is called eligible businesses that are called climate adaptation and mitigation. So I see some of the activities that you mentioned that are geared towards the private sector. So we're not just funding any pipelines, but we have a bracket where our mandates gears towards agribusiness, manufacturing, and high-valued services. So these are the targeted sectors that we are lending to. Okay. So we are starting from there, whereby we are developing this facility, whereby we will be deploying capital to the financial institutions. Then these financial institutions will be deploying that to the SMEs.
Okay, so this is a common platform by all of these banks that you mentioned, to streamline sort of the source of funding? Or what?
Exactly.
Okay.
So our mandate is to deploy capital for the SMEs through the banks.
Okay, so how do they assess it? How is this available?
So it's early days, right? What we're doing is that we've developed a list of eligible businesses or eligible business, we call it a taxonomy kind of thing, right? Where we are socializing this list with our PFIs and running through them, what are there in their portfolio? What are these businesses, are they there? Or can they explore engaging private sector that into the space? But they should be geared towards SMEs.
Okay.
Now, beyond that, we are also looking for innovative ways,
Okay.
whereby it could be a call,
Yeah.
whereby we would run this through our PFIs for them to collaborate to be able to deploy this this funding through them.
Okay, good. Dr. Boateng, you've heard from the state agencies, you've heard from the private sector, and now the financial institutions. What would you say to all that is going on in relation to the target set by IMANI, for instance, and your expectations?
I think the picture is still not very clear. I mean, with respect to how the private sector is going to be able to contribute. And we have the private sector here. I mean, the banks are here. Development Bank is more of the government's bank. So, of course, he will speak for Foster or speak to support what Foster is saying. But then we just want to hear from them, the private sector.
But he mentioned, though, not to rudely barge in, but he also mentioned quite a number of other banks that are private, though.
Yes.
That are on board the platform that he talked about.
That's good. He's speaking for them. I mean, hopefully, I believe we have some of them here, and I will personally would like to hear from them. I just want to ask Foster to clarify something, maybe make, and I think Abna is there. Maybe somebody should send the microphone to, Abna. Foster, you mentioned that the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which currently our president is chairing, is gearing up. And this is, I mean, my understanding is that this is modeled around the Bangladesh model. I just want to understand, so far, what are the numbers, that has been contributed, and looking at this, with respect to the prosperity plan, is this something that, you think we are on the positive path to be able to raise some funds?
Okay. I think I'll, Foster, maybe take note of that question. Let Dr. Jampon also come. He might also have a question for you, and then we'll put it all together. We'll take the rest, and then we can move on.
Yeah, so for me, quick one, I think what's very clear from the conversations here is that, one, the government and the related agencies are doing different things, right? So there's a tall list of pipeline of projects. But on the other side, you've got a private sector that doesn't seem to have access and information to this project. So clearly there's a disconnect. And in my world, you would say there is some information asymmetry. And so the key thing really for me is it should be possible to have a portal or some place to access, one, all of the plans that Foster and the likes have talked about. Number two, to see the pipeline of projects, right, on a year-by-year basis, all the way up to 2040, 2030, and then also translate this into the potential funding opportunities that the private sector can now access this. Because what is very clear is that bits of work is being done, but it's even at the ministry level, it's still not necessarily being harmonized or coordinated. And then when it comes to the people who implement this with the private sector side of things, you don't have access to the information, the funding flows, the projects, and it's, I think, one of the clear things that I'm getting and we have to work on is some public portal that all of these bits of information can be provided. But importantly, how we translate them into business opportunities, right? So, for example, the funding course that the DBG will be working on, or the Ghana Green Fund, you name it, all of these things should be in a place, one portal, one place I can go access, see the flows, which donor partner has committed what. On the government of Ghana side, what have they committed over the period, right? Then we can begin to bridge some of those things. Other than that, my worry then is that we'll still have silos and pockets of these interventions, and that would not allow us to fully harmonize the effect.
But did you hear anything from their submissions or interventions that gladdens you and feel that, you know, it meets some of the expectations that you highlighted in your presentation?
Absolutely. I mean, they're doing a lot of work. Personally, I'm actually doing some consultancy on the Green Ghana Fund, for example, to support that. But it needs to be more out there and people to appreciate, you know, what is happening. But clearly, the funding streams need to be added up. So we need to see, going back to Doc's point, we need to see how much have we accumulated or collected over the last couple of years, particularly 2021, 2022. Does that meet the 1.4 or so billion or the 3.5 billion of the unconditional ones, so that we can then begin to do the benchmarking and the assessment? So my worry is that there are pockets of interventions, but we still don't or cannot see the full picture as yet in terms of where we're going.
Okay. And
sorry.
Okay.
Is anyone from PEF here?
What?
PEF.
PEF.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I think they should
be
able to speak for us, right?
That's where we are going. Maybe you get somebody to speak for you. Let me take the microphone to the audience, and I'm sure that we also hear from the colleague from Ministry of Finance as well. But if anyone has a question at this point in time, shall we see behind? Yes, the first one. Let me take my friend in the category. Yeah. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, yes, my name is Andrew from the Embassy of Switzerland. So I wanted to just get a clarification from EPA with regards to the funding and then the NDCs. You mentioned that we require about $5.3 billion from donors to be able to do the conditional measures. And then you talked about Switzerland's contribution to the project that is being developed with the EPA. So I just wanted to clarify that those projects are not necessarily part of the NDCs. They are separate, and I think it's the funding from there is not towards the 47 measures under Ghana's NDCs.
Okay.
So it shouldn't be as part of the contribution from the donors. But
okay, so you take note of that and address that, because I heard you saying that you'd address that. You didn't mention your name and...
sorry, Andrew Asari from Embassy of Switzerland.
Good.
Yes. Sorry, and I have a second question with regards to DBG's approach with the banks. My question is really, how are they ensuring that the on-lending to the SMEs are at affordable rates?
Okay.
Yes.
Good. There's a gentleman at the far end there, yeah.
Lady as well. Ladies first.
All right, please, you take it.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruka Sanusi from the Ghana Climate Innovation Center. My comment and question is related to what the gentleman from the embassy just said, but also what the gentleman from the Development Bank of Ghana just said about financing for SMEs. My colleague spoke about, the crowding out of the private sector and access to finance. And you intimated that you're structuring that financing for SMEs, particularly for climate entrepreneurs, right? One of the things that we have found is that the conditionalities attached to any financing that you provide are actually very onerous to SMEs, right? And they're sometimes even no different to what exists already within the banking system, right? A lot of the entrepreneurs that we have supported over the past 5 or 6 years, a lot of the support that we give them grant support. They go on and maybe looking for additional, whether it's debt or equity or whatever. A lot of the financing that they have received when they've exited our incubator is offshore because of the restrictive conditionalities that's always attached to some of this financing. Okay. So the portal is important, but we need to contextualize the conditions attached to some of the loans and the financing that we're providing so that the people that need them, the people that contribute 70% of Ghana's GDP can actually access this financing. Right. It's not just a case of saying it's available, and then it's going to the big boys.
Okay.
It needs to come down to the big girls, or the smaller girls and the smaller boys as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I take the next one, and then we can take responses. Yeah.
My name is Cedric from the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. I want to make a contribution to the question that sought to find out how do we bridge the financing gap in the private sector. And if I say private sector, I want to go beyond the banks. We have heard about banks. I'm talking about the private sector in its entirety. And let me start from the assumption that the money is there in the private sector. But how do we ensure that the private sector will channel that funds or their funds or part of their funds toward addressing climate change? And that's where the focus of my submission lies. So if you look at the NDCs, the nationally determined contribution is focusing on addressing issues on mitigation. So we are saying that by 2030, we need to get to net zero. But that is on a national level. But the private sector, if you cascade the private sector, we do not have our industries, we do not have our companies saying that this is their roadmap towards net zero. So we have distillers, we have big companies, we have a lot of production factories in Ghana and across Africa. And these are big companies with big funding. But none of them has determined their carbon footprints. None of them have determined how they as a company are going to get to net zero. So this forum should begin to push that advocacy. That let us move these private sector to a level where they can commit to how they will get to net zero. Now when that happens, that is how they unlock their funds, because they are now going to allocate part of their budget towards projects and programs in achieving net zero. Then we'll begin to see that figure move from 3% to the 15, 18% that Doctor is talking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So I would let, in taking the responses, I will let Abena from the... Do we have a question there? No?
Yeah, I have a question and then
a
submission. Yes, I'm Francis from Oxfam.
Okay.
I get a sense that everything is rosy from the submissions that are made from Ministry of Finance, EPA, and the others. But what I wanted to know is what really are the challenges, in mobilizing the funds?
Yeah.
Because we are not getting that painted clearly. Because it also help us in how we shape the discussions. But I have two proposals as well in respect of mobilizing the funds. When COVID hit in 2020, the Minister of Finance went to Parliament and triggered some changes in our Petroleum Revenue Management Act to lower the cap for the GSF, the Ghana Stabilization Funds, below 300 million. 200 million, and that creamed off $200 million for us to spend, right? The big question for me now is that was in perpetuity. So we need to begin to see how do we revert to that provision in the law, and probably say that in the context of the challenges we are faced with, let's lower it to 200 million rather. So that we have an extra 100 million, run it by 1 year. That will give you about $1.2 billion, closer to what Theo had presented as the annual average that we may need in terms of financing. That's just one thing we need to do, because when you look at the NDCs, there's a 20% target for reducing methane, right, by 2030, and that relates to the oil and gas sector. And this provision also relates to the oil and gas sector. Now, to the mining sector, which is my second point, there's also the MIF, the Mineral Income Investment Fund, which now sort of uptakes the 5% state royalties that we take from mining companies, as well as dividends and the rest from companies that are in the sector. We need to also begin to understand what are the investment priorities of MIF in respect of climate change. And that will also be, I don't know if we have representation from MIF here, but we should be looking closely at the instruments and how we could channel them into climate-related interventions.
All right. Good. Thank you. So let's have the responses on the finance from Bina, and then maybe Foster, and then the rest EPA as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, okay. Good enough.
Thank you. So,
but if you can raise it more, I think it will be better.
Like that? Rather closer to me. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Interesting you say, you know, we seem to make it look like it's all rosy, and yet somehow we don't see the money. And it's the same thing I think we also say when we go to COP and all the other platforms, and we say, you tell us there's all this money out there, but somehow it's not trickling in. And one of the issues that hasn't come up so far at this platform is the fact that private capital, and that's the focus now. The NDC focuses on private capital, the fact that public financing alone cannot resolve our climate issues, and therefore there's a need to bring in a lot more private financing. And private financing follows commercially viable projects, economically viable projects. And so far, I'm sad to say, we don't seem to have a pipeline that is demonstrably commercially viable, whether from our private sector partners or even within government. Within government, we mostly, because we are thinking about climate as a public good, come up with projects that are socially, focuses on the social good and so on and so forth. There is the need to build the kind of capacity that enables us to reconfigure and redevelop our projects to focus on commercial viability and economic viability to enable us to tap into the funds, because they do exist. We're dealing with, and if you look at what the Paris Agreement and what it's based on, the first shares principles, to say the global north is responsible for where we are today. We're paying for the price of their industrialization, and therefore, per the Paris Agreement, they are obliged to pay for our adaptation, right, and mitigation efforts too. So you find that in the global north, you have businesses and industries that have net zero targets, and I like that submission about the fact that domestically we're not there yet, and I guess there's a reason for that. But in the global north, there are industries that have net zero targets that requires them to make investments to help them meet those targets. You have, for example, the shipping industry, you have the airline industry, you have the financial services industry. I think in COP26 you had the Glasgow G-Funds, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and these are pots of money, significant resources that we can tap into. But we can only do that when we can demonstrate a pipeline of commercial projects and programs. And to respond to this, and because we have been struggling with this for a bit, to respond to this, we have been engaging with our implementing agencies. A lot of the time, your reference is to the Ministry of Finance, which is to find the money for the implementing agency. But the implementing agency is the one who comes up with the project, which unfortunately is not commercially or economically viable. And therefore, you can't shop it. I mean, you can't sell it to an investor, right? So we're working with the MDAs, these are the implementing agencies, to develop their projects in a manner that's mindful of commercial viability, to enable us to tap into private financing. And I will touch on the CVF V20, which Foster mentioned. Ghana became chair in May 2022. It's a 2-year tenure. We are almost 1 year through. And the focus for the CVF and the V20 is to unlock private financing. It's not to say we reject other financing, but just to focus on private financing, because we've had little of that come through when it comes to climate action, and they have a lot more significant resources, but it's drawn to commercial viability. So we have these vehicles that are supposed to be economic cooperation vehicles that are supposed to excite the private sector about engaging with climate vulnerable countries, about solving climate change problems, but making some kind of earning something from this, whether it's towards net zero or whether it's something towards their wallets. These are done through the climate prosperity plans, and the climate prosperity plans leverage what every government has put together in terms of its climate strategy, and it takes into account the nationally determined contributions. Okay. The idea is to work with the V20 CVF Secretariat and the foundations that support them to develop a pipeline of projects that are commercially viable, that can then be presented to investors. And we believe that that's a faster route towards helping us meet our climate action objectives. We haven't completed the process. We are still in the early stages. What we have done so far is engage with the Children Investment Foundation Fund. Was it Fund Foundation? The work we're doing with them is to develop deal teams that can come in country to help us build the capacity, yes, but more importantly, develop the pipeline that can be presented at various platforms to enable us to get more private capital coming in.
All right. Okay. Do we take some responses for him? Yes, Foster, you can go ahead.
So just to add up, I think, yes, I can't say we are perfect. We are all trying to get to the point of achieving our objective. So we can't be perfect. There will be some lapse. But in terms of how we are approaching this, I think it's well coordinated, unless you have not followed the discussion and follow how we engage. Because in country, the Ministry of Environment, that is MESTI, is the one leading the climate change agenda, whilst the Ministry of Finance is looking at how we mobilize finances. So there's no disconnect. So I'm sure what maybe you want to see is that it's only the Ministry of Finance who is talking about the numbers. No, we will all talk about the numbers, but from different angles, because we can't have everything in mind.
But I think, Foster, just so we don't miss that point, the fact that the information is also not down there,
that is
it stays at the policy level.
So that is what I'm getting to. I'm surprised Doug is not mentioning it, Prof, because he led, we've also developed a tracking system where the inflows and also the expenditure is being captured and the story is being told. So if you look at the story that we indicated through the climate, the periodic study that we do, it's out of the tracking that we got those figures. And we have a system called the Climate FinTrack, and we are also looking at the end users, that's the public, to be able to access. We also created a portal where it's going to be for the end users and also for the CSOs to be able to make input for us to be able to generate. And at the same time, this is also linked to the Climate Data Hub, which is hosted by EPA. So there's a lot of interlinks and also engagements, and we sing the same song wherever we go. In terms of the numbers, Abna has talked about the fact that we are not there yet, but we believe that very soon we'll get there. In terms of the pipeline, after we developed the NDCs, the initial NDCs, there was another document, the NDC strategic document, which highlighted, it gave a whole list of projects we intended to carry forward to be able to meet our target as a country. And we keep on reviewing it. So I think there's something that is work in progress. In terms of, let me end because there's others to speak.
EPA, would you want to respond to?
Just to add to what Foster has said, I think it's very important from this meeting that information availability to all stakeholders is really, really key.
Yeah.
Because it seems we are at the policy level and we seem to have so much information.
Yeah.
But then our partners at the private sector, CSOs,
The general public.
they don't have it, right? And this is a bit worrying for me because some of the concerns that are coming for me, I thought should be public as at now, but they are not. So with this, the government of Canada, right, is currently supporting us with some grant support to implement what we call the bilateral support for MRV, what we call monitoring, reporting, and verification. This is to ensure that whatever we are doing from end to end is made available to all stakeholders across the country so that we will not come and sit here and seem as if all the information is with the government institutions and the other part of the public does not have
Okay.
this. So.
Okay. Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I want to explain some of the information put out here. You know, from his presentation, from Dr. Chapon's presentation, he estimated. So Ghana's GAG inventory estimates Ghana's emission as of 2019 to be about almost 60 million tons CO2 equivalent as of 2019. And then we also, from our estimation, project Ghana's emission to rise to about 100 million tons CO2 equivalent by 2030. But we don't want to achieve that kind of emission. So we are using the NDC as a tool to cut our emissions. And so the 34 program of actions that have been spoken about look at reducing Ghana's emission by 64 million tons CO2 equivalent by 2030. So what will be outside of the scope of the NDC. So we say if we implement the NDC, we are achieving 64 million tons CO2 equivalent. But Mohammed explained the conditional and the unconditional. So government of Ghana intends to implement 9 programs of actions, right? That would help reduce 24 million tons CO2 equivalent of the 64 million tons target that we have for ourselves. And those that are outside of the 64 million tons are those that we intend to implement using international support. And again, the Paris Agreement provides clear-cut procedures and clear-cut ways of supporting the implementation of the NDC. And so one of the approaches is what we spoke about in terms of using the carbon market that we have created in Ghana to push that kind of implementation. And I like the fact that our colleague Abna spoke of the net zero target or the obligation, domestic obligation of some of our international partners. So for example, we are working with the Click Foundation, and I made mention of the $500 million US dollars. So that investment is supposed to come into Ghana. The Click Foundation, by the way, is a foundation of bulk oil importers of the government of oil in Switzerland. So they have domestic obligation either to meet their carbon tax domestically or to meet their obligation under the emission trading scheme under the EU. So they intend to invest in green investment in Ghana and create carbon assets or carbon offsets, emission reduction, and use these credits to meet their domestic obligations. So that kind of arrangement is what we are looking at to push the implementation of the NDC and also achieve the ambition of the NDC. So if we say achieving the ambition of the NDC, as I said, we have a 64 million ton CO2 target. But what is outside of the NDC, meaning that we have about 36 million tons that will still be emissions, right? So we are seeking to also use that as a vehicle to target those that are outside of the NDC but are likely to contribute to our emissions. And so our colleague here from UNDP maybe can speak about some of the projects that we're working on, especially on the alternate wetting and drying technology that Mohammed spoke about. Thank you.
Okay. Mo wants to have 30
Yes,
seconds.
Sorry, I think
follow up
he
on that
asked a
and
very important question, right? That the agreement that we are implementing with the government of Switzerland, is it within the NDCs or outside the NDCs? So Pedro has given some component of the explanation. Now, the Paris Agreement, he indicated that we are working under Article 6.2 and 6.4 to implement the carbon market. Now, under Article 6.2, which is on cooperative approaches, any activity that will be implemented there, if it is not within the NDCs, which the country have submitted to the UNFCCC, it is not allowed.
Okay.
And now it is under this 6.2 that we signed the bilateral agreement with the government of Switzerland to implement the carbon market program. So automatically, all the activities that we are implementing with the government of Switzerland is within the NDCs.
Okay.
For example, if you look at the cooking stoves issue, it's there. If you look at the rice production, it's under sustainable agriculture production. If you look at the PV, solar PVs that we are working on, it's also under energy efficiency, under the energy component of the NDC. So all these issues have been connected.
Okay, let me acknowledge. Oh,
let me go to Madam Abuna. She made a very important comment about the fact that we don't have a clear-cut program for the private sector, especially looking at the issue of net zero within the private sector. Pedro, when he spoke earlier,
it's okay.
Sorry.
We understand. Now we have registered Pedro.
My nickname is Pedro, and he keeps.
We have registered it. Don't worry.
So he made a very important point that 2 years back we had undertaken an assessment to understand the extent to which we can push the private sector further, covering issues about emission reduction and net zero and what have you. And now, if you can actually put targets on companies to do that, then you have to implement what you call the emission trading schemes, because then when they falter, they should be able to have the opportunity to buy from their sister companies to fill up.
Okay.
But like I said, that is not possible. So as at now, we are rather trying to see how we can work with them to rather push them to make either technical or managerial changes within their operations to ensure that we are able to still move from a polluting company to one which is less polluting.
Okay.
For example, if you look at the...
I would have to push you to do this in 10 seconds.
Just a minute. The EPA's environmental impact assessment, now we have reviewed it to incorporate industrial reporting that you should indicate to us your activities which are polluting and measures that you've put in place to cut down on that pollution. The second aspect, if you look at the industrial processes, what we call boiler operations, right? That is mainly the key or the I component of the industries that contribute to emissions. And so with support from UNDP, we've been able to work with Joabin Oil Mills, Nutri-Food Ghana, to ensure that they are either able to replace their boilers, which some were installed since 1947, or change components that are very polluting. Okay. Again, if you look at palm oil producing, the artisanal palm oil producing, it's one of the worst polluting small-scale enterprises in Ghana.
I see.
And we are working with them now to see how best they can replace their stoves, their expellers, their cookers, and what have you, to ensure that they cut down on their emissions drastically.
Let's see if we can hear from some of the climate smart businesses that we have, because we have quite a number of them around. And then also, I think I recognize ISEP. ISEP is a partner of IMANI Ghana. ISEP, if you're here, just give us a wave. Good to see you, and thank you for coming. Also, CAT International, I recognize CAT. I saw Mr. Adomako somewhere. Do we have CAT? Good. CAT International. So, and UNDP, I've heard your name quite often around. UNDP, are you represented? Good. Is there something you want to say quickly? Okay. ISEP? Yes, please, go ahead. You want to say something? Okay, you're fine. Any of the businesses and any question? Yes, madam.
Hi, everyone. My name is Deborah. I'm with the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources. But right now, I am not going to make a submission on behalf of the ministry. I'm rather making a general one, which is first going to be a submission, then a question and suggestion to the CCUs at both MEST, EPA, and most likely to Foster from Ministry of Finance. Now, you would all agree that from the discussions that have gone on so far, We know that there's a lot going on in the space of climate finance, and the private sector has not been left out. The private sector has been the focus for most of these things. For instance, the Ministry of Finance leading climate change track. It's to help address some of the issues Dr. Theo mentioned, talking about making information available and accessible to the private sector. Again, Canada is supporting Ghana to implement the MRV, which there are components that I can speak specifically on. For, say, the waste sector, we have plans to actually provide technical assistance to the private entities on how to develop bankable projects to access some of these funds. The DBG has also mentioned ways to make money available. And we remember, we can recall, Foster mentioned the placards that people held at COP last year has caused the United States to give $1 billion to the adaptation fund and another $300 million. So then we can take our minds off the domestic area to the multilateral regions, and there are funds available, right, for the private sector and what have you, and you have to find ways to be able to access these funds because they are not just there. Yeah. There are requirements. There are requirements that you have to meet to be able to access the funds. You have to be able to develop bankable projects and all. So the point I'm trying to make here is that at the domestic level, we are doing something. At the multilateral level, the funds are available. As a private, so I'm moving on to the question. The private sector, for me, I think is not curious enough to find out some of these information. And so they are unable to access these funds. And I'm not talking about loans. I'm talking specifically about some of these grants because the $1.3 billion that the United States has given to the adaptation fund is there for all countries, all LDCs especially. And so if you don't tap into it, it's on no one, basically, right? Okay. So we would have to find ways to tap into it. So the private sector, are we curious enough? Yes, Climate Change Track would find a way to make the information available. The MRV would help. But I think the private sector would have to find a way to fish out some of these information while we wait for it to be as available as we would want it. I know of different number of workshops that have been held to prep the private sector on some of these things. And to be able to help address this private sector curiosity I'm suggesting, I come back to my own MESTI, EPA, and then the Ministry of Finance, and I ask again for the purposes of general knowledge to all of us here, are there specific ways that these private sectors or specific protocols that the private sector has to follow to be able to access some of these information while they wait for you to make it a general public knowledge? Okay. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So, Dr. Dramani, I would love for you to pick on this because there's a lot of mention on the private sector and you are leading the private sector. Are you assessing information? You also you may want to touch on what Tabena spoke about earlier.
Well, so strictly speaking, we are publicly funded. We are funded by donor funds at the Ghana Climate Innovation Center. And so we may not be through and through private sector, but we do, by the work that we do, we support private enterprises. And so within that context, we come to appreciate, the challenges that they face in nurturing and growing their businesses. Which among other things relate to access to finance. Now, one of the issues I would like clarity on, because I believe that beyond having an investable business with a good business model and all of that, which then, if you like, in the language of Abena, is a commercially viable business. Beyond being commercially viable, I believe that the other constraints to accessing capital. My question is, what level of ingenuity is being introduced into the operations of the Development Bank of Ghana, for instance, to ensure that the financial institutions that will play in your scheme of things, will change the landscape relative to access to finance. Now, you also talk about the development of a green taxonomy. I believe that, and this perhaps will be to the Minister of Finance, because I believe that it is more in terms of the impact that it can make, and in terms of compliance. It would have been better if there was an attempt to develop this by maybe the Minister of Finance, which is the policy institution, and that then will then guide the operations of all other financial institutions in that space to ensure that we are able to leverage the kind of impact that this is able to create. So to what extent are you developing this in partnership with the Minister of Finance? And the Minister of Finance, is there any attempt on your part to develop this and ensure that eventually this becomes, a vehicle that ensures that sustainability and the origination of capital and loans and all of that are pinned to climate change related investments? Thank you.
Okay. So I would urge that you tie that in with your final remarks and look at what fiscal policies can support the climate smart businesses to be viable.
Yeah, no, just a small remark, and adding on to Dramani's point about the green taxonomy. And one of the things that, for me, again, I think it's lacking in all of the conversation here, which is that I don't see a green growth strategy, right? So we're talking of NDCs, we're talking about projects, pipelines, etc. But what's the big game here, right? How are we trying to create these new enterprises? How is that tied into your industrial policy? What sort of then fiscal subsidies or incentives, etc., do you provide to your private sector, to the enterprises, to create that innovation and the ecosystem that is required? Again, I'm saying this, and it's my final remark, that without that clear green growth strategy or agenda with benchmarks, because it's tied to your NDCs, but this is how you take your NDCs from policy into implementation plan. We've got a financing strategy, which is so well and good, and I think UNDP supported on that, but it needs to be anchored and driven by something, and which is where, without that clear pathway of that green growth strategy, it would still end up being pockets. In the US, you've got recently the Inflation Reduction Act, and you see them pushing for, electric vehicle value chains, etc., trying to get a bit of the cycle, although they're like 10 years late to the game, because, the Chinese almost control pretty much everything there. But that, I think, is one of the things that perhaps at the government level and at the private sector level, we should start thinking more about and use all these NDCs, etc., to be underpinned by a clear green growth strategy or agenda.
Okay. Ghana Development Bank, I would bring you in for your closing remarks on this one.
Okay, thank you. To respond to Doc's question, how are we doing with the banks, the PFIs? So before a PFI is onboarded, one of the key things we look out for is having an environmental and social management system. Now, this is key, and you may not be aware, but a lot of banks have the system but not have them operationalized. So the system would identify and let them assess the environmental and social risk and opportunities that are therein. A lot of these banks see this as a risk management compliance function. We see them as a management function, whereby whilst you're looking at the risk element, you also look at the opportunities aspects. So all our banks that we've onboarded have a robust system that we do a detailed due diligence. And this is an assessment that we itemize and we evaluate. We have a team that goes there and do their assessment. Post this onboardment or this process, we have workshops with our PFIs, right? Now, these workshops are supposed to introduce the other opportunities that DBG has, and also things like the taxonomy that you are mentioning. We socialize this activity with them, this list. And not only in our PFIs, we're also speaking to the Ministry of Finance and also EPA on this document. So this document has been created in partnership with our development partners that lists out what is a green business. You see a lot of people talking about this is green, this is not green, and it's quite confusing, right? So having this list set the tone for us to now work with them to develop these products.
Okay.
Now, this product is not yet out there. That's why I'm informing you that this is what we are working on. And I think by the end of the year, you see a launch. And not having a launch, we'll see that as financing these pipelines.
All right.
And there are some pipelines that are in there that we are working with our developing our PFIs. Now, to add to that, we are not just giving long-term financing. We are also helping our PFIs to understand these SMEs that are to be financed. Because there's a lot of financing, but appraising a green finance product is different from just a lending. So there's a lot of learning that, and also we letting them appreciate that it's not just having these documents or having financials looked at, but also looking at how are you measuring, the impacts and also or the others, right? So yes, and you mentioned one thing about guarantees, right? My deputy CEO made mention that the DBG will be launching the DBG guarantee very soon, which will support not just the lending and also the technical support, but also provide that insurance for these business, for the PFIs to be in this business.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I've gone into the lunchtime, I think about 15 minutes. First, I wanted to say something. Let's do that in a minute, please.
Okay, since you are asking us to wind up, I think I want to say three things. One, the ministries have not been set up to implement projects. And therefore, in terms of projects related to climate change, will be implemented by no other group of people but the private sector, mostly. So what I would want to request that the private sector get closer to the policy makers. We will continue to create the needed awareness. We will continue to build capacity, but get closer so that we can do this simple thing. Work and work together. That is the only way we can get there. Okay. We have to work and work together. The other thing is that in terms of assessing financing, I think every financial institution has its criteria for making financing available. We need to understudy this so that we can be able to assess funding.
Okay.
The safeguards within the climate arena are very important for us to be able to assess financing.
Okay,
so let's get ourselves familiar with these safeguards so that we can assess the needed finance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I've run out of time. I'm told the lunch is served and we've gone into the time already. So what we would advise is that during lunch, and this time around I would encourage all of us, a lot of us, to partake in the lunch. Stay around. You can still ask your questions after the closing remarks by Dennis Asari. Let's put our hands together and welcome him.
Thank you very much. A round of applause for our panelists. They've done a very good job. And so on our part, we want to say thank you to everybody who has participated in this climate change consultative dialogues. This is the second and final one. And we also want to thank ASEP for partnering IMANI to bring these dialogues. And while the conversation was ongoing, we kept assessing ourselves as an institution. We think we have achieved the purpose for setting up these consultative dialogues. One, we have increased our understanding of our ability to finance climate change. Again, we've also increased the awareness of stakeholders private sector companies here now understand how they can engage ministries, department, agencies. Then again, government institutions have also shared a great deal or a wealth of information with us on what they are doing and how we can all collaborate and sort of synchronize our activities to ensure that the information is out there and we are working towards achieving or realizing the goals in our NDCs. Then again, we are also enhancing demand-side accountability. So for us from the team IMANI, we think we've achieved the purpose for starting these dialogues. And this is just the beginning. There are other works that we are also going to do to strengthen that accountability, ensure that we partner government to achieve the goals we've set in the NDCs. And by 2030, if we convene here again, we will be able to tell a very good story. So thank you very much for making time to attend this dialogue. And we will also do well to engage you for the next dialogues that come. And please, when you go, kindly check your mail. We will send across an M&E form for you to review and give us recommendations on areas that we did not look at during these dialogues and how we can improve on our consultations. Thank you very much, and please enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
Okay, so the lunch is served. You are supposed to serve yourself. Ensure that you serve yourself before you leave. Whilst that is happening, if you have questions, you can still ask them. Most of our panelists, our resource persons are still around to be engaged. It's also the best time to connect and interact with colleagues.
Thank you.